So our sponsors are the Internet Society of Washington, D.C., the World Wide Web Foundation, the Institute for International Economic Policy, Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at GW, and the Center for International Governance Innovation. So, okay, I'm going to get started. And again, welcome everybody. I'm Susan Aronson, and I direct this flag, basically, the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, where we work on training policymakers on digital trade and data governance and map it. And so I wanted to do this event for a long time because it seemed to me that the templates for digital trade were really out of date. But other countries have come up with some new ideas. And one of them is the DIPA, which is a new approach, which was negotiated among New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, which focuses on mutual digital transformation and trust. And it's an open module that has, an open multilateral, which has modules instead of chapters. And then Australia and Singapore also have a new approach, a digital economic agreement focused on data and the future digital economy. So to discuss this, we have three experts today from three different countries. We have Stephanie Honey from Honey Consulting and also from New Zealand. We have Joshua Meltzer from the Brookings Institution, but also from Australia. And my great friend from Canada on Canada Day, LeBlond, from the University of Ottawa and the Center for International Governance Innovation. So let's get started. And thank you again for attending. So I'm going to begin with just a few questions for these brilliant people. And then we want you to ask questions, which I'll read to them. So if you can start putting your questions up, we'd love to hear them. So my first question is, one thing that's always struck me about this is these digital trade agreements are built on language to facilitate e-commerce, but that doesn't really fit lots of new services like AI or apps where data is at the core. So DIPA, a good example of this rethink. Stephanie, why not you go first?
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and it's a great privilege to be here with you this morning. And DIPA is quite a rethink. I mean, for one thing, it was signed digitally. I think that's probably the first time ever in a trade agreement, thanks to COVID. But it is quite unusual in a few ways. For one thing, it's a dedicated digital agreement. It's not just a chapter in an FTA. And it's not really about market access barriers in the traditional sense. It tries to take a more holistic look at what happens behind the border in the digital economy. I mean, obviously digital trade goes well beyond e-commerce. It's not just about buying something on Amazon. It's more to do with digitally enabled transactions. And so, as you said, DIPA goes well beyond some of those typical e-commerce chapters and really looks at the data governance of the economies involved. So it looks at things like ethical frameworks for AI, digital identity. It's got language about trying to enable innovation, regulatory sandboxes, digital inclusion. And overall, it's trying to ensure that the systems in each country can talk to each other. So there's a big emphasis on interoperability and compatibility. There's a lot of discussion specifically about data governance. So it's got the CPTPP provisions. All three of the countries involved are CPTPP members. So it reiterates their provisions on cross-border data flows and on forced data localization. But it also has language about the importance of access to data, open government data, how to build trust. So it's got principles for personal information protection, cybersecurity, and so on. And it's also interesting because it doesn't actually attempt to resolve those issues. It really puts some high-level principles in place and then leaves a kind of a work program to evolve those. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that in the modern economy, you know, there's this critique of the WTO and other trade agreements that they haven't really kept pace with what's happening technologically or commercially, and regulators are still really struggling with that. And so what DEPA tries to do is put in place a kind of living agreement where it can be updated as technology evolves and over time. And as you said, it's also designed in modules, so the hope is that over time, others will look at what DEPA has done and pluck out different modules, put them in their own trade agreements, or, you know, it can influence what's happening in the WTO or in other settings. And I think the hope is that it will be expanded to other members over time as well.
I want to join right now. Josh, do you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here, Susan. It's great. It's a great group, and really happy to be talking about these issues. Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, if you look at it, well, look. So clearly, if you look at you know, the WTO as the foundation multilateral agreement says nothing about the internet, free trade agreements really up until the US-Korea free trade agreement had e-commerce chapters in it, but I think, to your point, we're certainly you know, more geared towards the e-commerce side of the digital trade world. The idea that there were transactions happening online, but ultimately you were moving goods across borders, and also provisions which sort of tended to be more focused on sort of the business commercial side to facilitate you know, recognition of e-signatures. And those types of specific issues which had actually been dealt with elsewhere in UNCITRAL and other places, but were being sort of essentially put also into the trade agreements. But I think, you know, since Korea and then really most substantially with the CPTPP, and I then think it's been further developed in important ways in the USMCA that just came into effect, and the US-Japan digital trade agreement, you see a much greater focus, I think, on what's actually increasingly driving the digital trade space, which is data flows and services. And so, you know, I think the focus has appropriately shifted to be a lot more comprehensive. You know, I think DEPA is a useful sort of addition to the discussion around what a comprehensive digital trade agreement should look like. And so, you know, there's a lot of good ideas in there which clearly, you know, need to be expanded on and built out further. But, you know, it gives a good sense of just how broad this topic could potentially be if you want to be comprehensive about all the issues that are involved.
Thanks. Patrick?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion, which is really important. I think to build on what Stephanie and Joshua said, what this all demonstrates, and I think DEPA is interesting in that regard, where the aim is to go beyond a trade agreement. So building in a way on the provisions that are found in CPTPP, but recognizing, as Joshua said, that, you know, these issues are much broader than just about trade. You know, whether it's about the ethics of AI or data governance, and I think that the realization is that trade agreements or even the World Trade Organizations are not necessarily the right forums, if we can say, or agreements or regimes to govern data. And govern digital, you know, I mean, I think ultimately what we're realizing is that we have to separate the sort of digital trade part to the sort of data governance or digital governance part, where, you know, a little bit like we do, for instance, and the example I like to use is financial services, right? So in our trade agreements, we talk, there are chapters on financial services to allow the, you know, financial services to be traded in a way across borders. Except that there's a whole regime separate from that, which is all about regulating the banks, the financial institutions, and regulating finance, right? Whether it's the Securities and Exchange Commissions, and we have international standards, best practices that countries are supposed to abide by. And those are recognized in trade agreements, but they're not fundamentally part of the trade agreements. We don't ask those trade agreements or even trade organizations, again, like the WTO, to be the standard setters, right? those are separate. And I think this is a recognition that we have to have when it comes to data, and especially cross-border data flows, which are fundamental to digital trade in all its form, whether it's e-commerce or the Netflixes of the world and things like that, where if we want to have those flows in a way cross borders in a way that people and businesses and governments trust, we have to have common standards. And I think this is where DEPA is building towards. At least that's my understanding, and from what Stephanie said. Now the question is where are we going to build those standards together, and how are we going to do that together? Because there is a recognition that we need to have that, and I think that's a huge issue. Can we build on existing stuff like the OECD is already working on that level? Do we need to build, some have called for a data standards board or a data stability board or digital stability board, these kinds of things. And I think that's where the discussion really has to go beyond just, trading digital goods and services.
Thank you. So let me ask a different question, building on what you said, which is, you're right, that financial services, there has to be some degree of interoperability. What role should interoperability play in these trade agreements, Josh?
So the way I think about interoperability is that it's recognizing the reality that countries are going to regulate on issues that are going to affect opportunities for digital trade, and specifically data flows in different ways. So if you look at, I think privacy is probably the easiest and most straightforward example, where the EU's gone down one path with GDPR, the US has got a completely different approach to privacy, China's gone in a very security-focused approach to privacy, and countries around the world have privacy regimes or developing privacy regimes which differ in important ways. And this is notwithstanding the OECD privacy principles and the APEC privacy framework, where there is a pretty broad-based common set of privacy principles out there, but nevertheless the principles, because they are principles, are sufficiently broad that countries have had a lot of leeway to go in different directions and still be consistent with the principles. So it's sort of, I think, a cautionary tale about the limits to principles that driving convergence or minimizing regulatory diversity, and interoperability picks up on the need to nevertheless find ways to allow data to flow given different approaches, different domestic regulatory approaches. And you begin to see this reflected in trade agreements, right? So, US TPP had some of this, but I think USMCA is very explicit about the importance of interoperability mechanisms, and in fact, points to the APEC cross-border privacy rules as a specific example of a useful interoperability framework. Another one which I think is worth pointing out is the Privacy Shield, which effectively allows personal data to flow between the US and the EU, notwithstanding the very different approaches to privacy between the US and the EU. So I think how we do this is I think an absolutely essential agenda now, because we are in a world where data flow restrictions for privacy, for consumer protection, for security, for law enforcement, for financial regulatory purposes are only growing. And so we have to find ways of trying to minimize the impact of these data flow restrictions. And interoperability, the term is essentially the approach. What ultimately is an interoperability framework is, basically it's a form of a mutual recognition agreement, and there are various forms they can take. And there's been a lot of work done on this, and this is not new. But if you look at, for instance, the Privacy Shield, in effect, what has happened is that under Privacy Shield, the US has agreed to do some additional things around privacy, and Ombudsman and the State Department extend some dispute settlement resolution mechanisms to EU citizens, lift the level of privacy somewhat, and that regime itself has been recognised by the EU as being equivalent. So you have a form of essentially a recognition by the EU of an equivalent outcome in the US. Under APEC cross-border privacy rules, you have a slightly different setup where effectively everyone's agreed that the privacy framework will form a floor, and then everyone sort of goes and does privacy legislation based on that floor. And then you have a set of institutional mechanisms which allow businesses, governments to participate, businesses then to be deemed compliant. And then everyone essentially recognises that these businesses allow, you can transfer personal data amongst these compliant businesses. So it's a broader form of mutual recognition there. But there are different iterations of that. But I do think that these are the types of mechanisms we're going to have to build on if we're going to seriously address the issue of growing restrictions, but the importance of cross-border data flows.
Let me press on that, if I may, because that talks about interoperability related to personal data and its national security effects, or its freedom of association effects, or its healthcare effects. But what about other types of data, such as public data? Does anyone want to comment on that? Like lots of governments hoard data.
Well, Susan, maybe I could comment on that, because I think DEPA has tried to grapple with this as well. I mean, as I said before, interoperability and compatibility of systems is a really big theme through a lot of its provisions. And on the government data side, it really emphasises the importance and the value of open government data. Which, you know, I think we can already see that there's a huge sort of social and commercial potential from making that data more widely available. But to Josh's point about looking at this through a more analog trade policy frame, I mean, a lot of this is essentially around a kind of mutual recognition model. You know, you don't need to have common standards. I think that is obviously the most kind of trade friendly. But the fact is that you can have systems talking to each other at the technical level, at the regulated level, at the policy level, as long as there's an acceptance by all the parties that those systems are able to work together, you know, you can unlock the commercial potential or the kind of the social outcomes that you want. So a couple of more mundane examples from DEPA, for instance, there's one part of the trade facilitation chapter module which talks about e-invoicing. You know, that's a very practical thing for businesses that strips out some of the kind of cross-border trade costs. And the DEPA approach is to look at interoperability of standards for e-invoicing, which is something that Australia and New Zealand are in the process of developing across the Tasman as well. Which will have a real commercial impact. Another example would be digital identity, where obviously you've got some countries in the world that have a very sort of centralized national digital identity system, or other countries that look at a more decentralized self-sovereign identity model. But under DEPA, the idea is that, you know, there's an acceptance that those systems can work together to enable cross-border commerce or other cross-border activities without, you know, having the impediment of either achieving the same system or having systems that don't really operate together.
Thank you. Patrick, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think when we talk about interoperability, it seems to me that there are three types, right? Stephanie referred to one, which is the data itself, and in a way making it accessible across borders, because as we know, data comes in all shapes and forms, and it's not, how do you access it, how you treat it, already requires some kind of interoperability. Then there is the issue of the processes, the procedures around how this data is treated, whether it's transformed and all these things, and that also calls for interoperability. And then there's the third one, which is the first one that Joshua mentioned, which is regulation and governance. Well, this is all governance, obviously, but regulation and the interoperability of regulation of data and digital trade more broadly. But one of the issues here is we talked about mutual recognition, but who decides on this mutual recognition? Is it again just on a bilateral basis, where two countries say, okay, well, I recognize that your country has similar standards to ours, and therefore we can trade data among ourselves, and then which is in a way the EU model. Right? The EU model with their adequacy decisions decides that, you know, we think that your model is good enough, and I guess there's some kind of reciprocity, and then personal data can flow across borders. But then obviously this can be taken away. You know, we talked about the privacy shield, which is very much criticized in Europe, and there are calls for the EU to actually revoke it. In Canada, we have PIPEDA, which is our law that governs you know, private data held by businesses or you know, private sector organizations, and there, you know, everyone agrees that you know, we have to modernize our law because it's no longer compliant or in a way interoperable with the GDPR, and there is a risk that we might actually lose our adequacy decision. So there's a lot of pressure on Canada to change that. In the UK right now, because of Brexit, they're facing the same situation. Where, you know, as of January 1st, technically the UK will be outside the GDPR, and unless they have some kind of agreement or some adequacy decision from the European Commission, they won't be able to flow data across to the EU, which could be a huge impediment to cross-border trade. So one of the issues around interoperability is on what basis is it done? Does it vary, you know, from bilateral relationship to bilateral relationship? What does that do for business ultimately? And is there uncertainty? Like, do we have to have some kind of contracts to say, okay, well, you know, we have this mutual recognition agreement for the next 5 years, and then what? And who has the influence on this? You know, we know the EU does. What about the US? So I think, you know, it brings back maybe to this issue of DIPA, where, you know, do we need a broader agreement with some common standards beyond just principles to make this kind of interoperability, to say, okay, here's kind of the framework under which this works, and everyone, you know, if everyone agrees with this and follows these rules, and we'll make sure that they do, then data can flow across, you know, those member states, and then of course you can invite more to join. But if we follow this sort of spaghetti bowl approach, which we've used for FTAs, I'm a little worried that, you know, it's going to create, make it impossible, especially for SMEs, to navigate these rules. It's already difficult in a national context, right, for a lot of SMEs to deal with, you know, privacy issues and the regulations. We just got the second year report on the GDPR, which is very cumbersome for smaller and medium-sized enterprises to actually deal with the GDPR. So I think it raises a number of questions as to, you know, if we do interoperability, are we going to create it, you know, again, create more inequalities between businesses across countries, you know, where the richer countries will have a benefit versus the poorer countries or less developed. Or so I think there are a number of issues that need to be addressed. I'll stop. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Hey, audience, we only have one question from you, so I really encourage you to ask these thoughtful folks some questions. I have a few more I can ask them, but we really want to hear from you, so please do put them in the Q&A. Okay, let me ask you guys some other questions until we get some more. You know, at one time, there was this notion that the internet was supposed to encourage openness and free flow of data around the world. And yet we are coming, you know, we're trying to come up with these trade agreements that have exceptions to the rules and then provisions designed to encourage free flow. So what are the best ways to limit cross-border barriers and encourage free flow? Josh, you want to go first there?
What are the best ways? So you broke up a little bit at the end. Limit.
Oh, sorry. To encourage free flow of data and limit the barriers to the cross-border data flow.
Yeah. So I guess as I said before, we're seeing you know, certainly in Asia, but globally, growth in restrictions on data flows. And so I think the first thing is to get a handle on the drivers of these data flow restrictions. And there seems to me at least to be, you know, at least 3 or 4 key underlying drivers. One of them is essentially the privacy driver, which is you're concerned about how your data will be treated in the third country. So you restrict data flows to third countries unless they're also providing equivalent levels of privacy. So that's a concern about the regulation of third country. One is your regulators feel that they need access to the data domestically to do their job. So that drives a lot of financial regulation, which requires data to be localized. So that, for instance, was part of why the US Treasury was very reluctant to get on board with a data free flow commitment for financial services and TPP, even though they've now found a compromise solution in USMCA. But you see that in a lot of countries in Korea and in Indonesia and elsewhere. A third driver is just government sensitivity about the information that's available on the internet, whether it's political sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, religious sensitivities. So you see a lot of regulation often aimed at the ISPs that, requires forms of censorship and so forth. And then you do also have, I think, just plain vanilla sort of protectionist instincts where they're essentially trying to shield their domestic market from competition from other digital players, and so they block access to websites and so forth. And each of these drivers, I think, requires a different solution. And this is a longer answer, and I've written about this, so I don't want to take up too much time. But I think that there's a trade policy solution to each driver, and just sort of headlines are, the interoperability discussion we just had, I think, is one way of getting at the concern about regulation in another country. That's the privacy issue, but it could come up with consumer protection and health data. I think the financial concern, which drives the data localization, I think USMCA is potentially the model. There's a pretty sort of cumbersomely worded compromise there. But I think that may be a way forward. But it ultimately applies to governments, but requires businesses to provide the data in a sort of timely, immediate manner. And so I think we need to do more to build confidence that this would actually work. I think on competition, frankly, we're back to just trade policy 101, and we should get data flow commitments with appropriate exceptions and use that to ferret out what's legitimate and what's otherwise sort of, essentially protectionist measures. And then I think, we're just going to have to live with government sensitivity around the politics and the culture and the religious drivers, and just try to keep that as narrow as possible. I think, we have an exception for, public morals as in the WTO and in other FTAs. And I don't think there's much trade policy can do to shift the dial on that one. I think all we can do is try to contain it within reasonable bounds.
Stephanie?
Not much to add to Josh's very comprehensive and thoughtful answer there, but I would make one observation, which is, I think, just continuing to talk about these issues, whether it's in the context of the WTO e-commerce negotiations or settings like APEC or, bilateral or plurilateral kind of fora is really important, because I do think at least some of those restrictions on cross-border data flows aren't very well grounded in a kind of a technological understanding. I think to Josh's point about, for instance, privacy or cybersecurity, there's, with our kind of analog brains, there's a tendency to think, well, the data will be safer or more private if it's here, with me. But actually that doesn't really understand technologically how, data can be encrypted, sharded, stored in the cloud. I think there's an education process that's needed for policymakers as well, to be able to design good regulatory solutions to the actual problem that they're trying to get at here.
That's the perfect commercial for the hub, because that's our rationale for being. But anyway.
There you go.
Can I say something?
Yeah, I just called you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear that. So one of the issues, obviously, there are a few issues that I'd like to add to what has been said, is that, if we look at the language in the CPTPP and then the USMCA, there is this kind of general exception, right, which is termed, the legitimate public policy exception for governments to actually limit cross-border data, right? So it's like, data should flow, but we allow for exceptions. Unfortunately, in those agreements, what is considered legitimate, a legitimate public policy objective has not yet been defined in any way, right? I often joke that should China join the CPTPP, which some are now actually arguing for, its model with the Great Firewall, which most people in the West would think, well, that's certainly not along the lines of allowing cross-border flows and things like that. China could easily claim, I would think, that they have a legitimate public policy objective for doing what they're doing in terms of national or political stability, for instance. And then the question is, well, who's to say what is legitimate, right? And do we want, one of the things that concerns me is that by leaving this kind of language in these agreements, is that ultimately who's going to decide what is legitimate, right? It's a little bit like the whole national security exception. Who decides what is national security? In some cases, it's egregious, kind of most people could agree, but ultimately, do we want a panel of 3 arbiters deciding, non-elected, non-democratic, deciding what is legitimate for a country to do or not? And that, to me, that it's a very slippery slope, and no one has kind of dared. We put the language there in our trade, in those trade agreements, but we don't know. Sorry, my phone just rang. So it's really an issue where do we want to do that, and to what extent can we allow the current situation with the exceptions to survive, or do we want to actually decide, put much more details into what is legitimate in terms of privacy, in terms of the things that Joshua mentioned, because that to me is a real issue. But then this brings it back to in a way, a more fundamental question, which is, in some cases, and Canada is the prime example, we've taken on international commitments. We've adopted these exceptions without defining them, but we haven't really decided on a national kind of data governance framework or data regulation framework. So there seems to be a disconnect between international commitments to cross-border data flows, but without having decided exactly what we're going to do at the national level. And one of the questions is, have we tied our hands to some extent or not, right? What if in Canada we decide that we want to regulate content for Facebook and other social platforms, but we have signed the USMCA and we want to make those platforms liable for what they're doing, but then the USMCA says, no, you can't, right? They're not liable. You've agreed in the agreement, following in a way US law, that those platforms are not liable in any way for their content. So I think that's also calls on kind of trying to integrate what happens at the national level with these international commitments. And maybe again, this is where DIPA is a good model, at least to start those kinds of discussions at the international level, better than maybe the WTO current e-commerce discussions.
I think you've made 2 really important points. First, about the coherence of the national and international regulations, especially at the WTO, where many developing countries don't have yet these sectors, and yet they're negotiating about them. They have no idea how to regulate what they don't have. And then your other point about the disconnect between using exceptions, do you narrow them, or do you have actually, very strict language? We've got a bunch of questions, so let me get to them. So X person asks, many trade agreements also seek to provide investor protection and make provisions for solving conflicts between businesses and states. How is that addressed in agreements on digital trade, where legislation and regulation are still being developed? Does anyone want to take that? No one? Patrick, can you handle that?
Oh, sorry. I was going to let others maybe take that question first.
Okay. Does anyone want to answer that question?
Well, the question about investor protection.
I think they're asking, is that model for solving, is that relevant to digital trade?
But again, the issue with investor protection is that it doesn't, it's about expropriation, right? a lot of it, and some imposing rules that make that your investment loses its value. I mean, could the model? I think the issue is much more an issue of actually having regulations and having interoperability. So I don't see how the sort of ISDS model could work in this context, because in a way what we've been talking about is that we have to have much clearer rules about what the rules of the game are. We start from the premise that cross-border data flows are good, right? But we also recognize that governments have the right and in a way the duty to regulate data, to govern data, to protect their citizens, to protect themselves, their data, to protect national security, those kinds of things. So I think the issue is really about what's allowed, what's not allowed, within what framework, what are the standards to allow cross-border data flows, even when it comes to using AI or AI services. We want to protect citizens, consumers, these kinds of things. And that's not really how the investor state regime functions, right? It's not so much about regulating the conduct of business or governments in that sense. It's about regulating, allowing for compensation if a government basically makes a company's investment valueless ultimately, either by expropriation or adopting a highly discriminatory regulation. But in this case, it's much broader in terms. So that's why I mentioned it's much more keen to me towards what we have for financial regulation, right? Those kinds of standards, whether it's for banking, insurance, securities, accounting. So that model seems to be much more appropriate in this case than the sort of investor state regime.
Okay, I want to get to these other questions, so I'm going to do that. So current definition of digital trade doesn't say anything about data, so how can you get interoperability at the WTO? Does anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I don't think we should focus too much on definitions of digital trade. I mean, the core provisions in the actual agreement are clear in terms of actually commitments to data flows, to avoiding data localization and the like. And so, the importance of data flows in these more recent FTAs, you see this in deeper as well, is central. The question, part of the challenge is, and this sort of picks up a little bit on Patrick's previous point about the exceptions provisions, which is that a couple of things. One is that notwithstanding, for instance, TPP, we do still see continued growth in data flow restrictions, which may point to in some cases, for instance, Vietnam had phased in commitments over time. In other cases, it may be the governments think that they can rely on the exceptions provision to justify these restrictions. And so what we need, in addition to what we've already got, is a regime which gets at some of the underlying drivers of the data flow restrictions, which leads into this conversation around interoperability mechanisms.
Stephanie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just I guess to bring it back to a more practical level. I mean, I think one of the areas that the WTO members are negotiating on in that agreement or in those negotiations is around some of the more quotidian trade facilitation areas. And, I think even if you don't get into the lofty heights of what's our data governance framework, you can do some very important commercially oriented work there. So, for example, around recognition of e-signatures, that's a very practical thing that helps strip out costs from cross-border trade. And I know that that's one of the areas that, there's been a lot of discussion about in the WTO context. So it comes back essentially to, these different levels of or layers of interoperability. Is it the technical standards? Is it the systems talking to each other? Is it the, kind of regulated acceptance of particular tools? So, I think that there's a lot that can be done, even if you have to quarantine off some of the more contentious, you know, kind of fundamental concepts of data flows and what's legitimate there.
Thank you. Okay, here's another question. We'll start with Patrick. Would ambitious data governance provisions in a future US-EU trade agreement balkanize the issue, or could it serve as a vanguard for plurilateral and multilateral governance?
Well, ultimately, it depends what the EU and the US agree to. Interestingly enough, the approach seems to be very different on the EU and the US. So, I mean, the US sort of imposed, in a way, its privacy, the privacy shield on the US. The US approach is been very much, as far as I understand it, although you, Susan, know a lot more about that than I do, is to in a way open up access, right, for its companies to other countries' markets, and ensuring the ability of data to flow across borders, and for their companies to be able to offer their services into these other markets in a way from the US, for instance, and limit ultimately the ability of national regulation to prevent this cross-border the flow of the cross-border data. So through data localization, for instance, or again, you know, in the context of the USMCA. You know, preventing making, you know, social platforms liable for their content, right? So in a way, trying to export a non-regulatory system, whereas the EU is the opposite. To say, well, we have the GDPR, and you want to flow data between our two countries. Well, you have to accept our ways of doing, right? So whether an agreement can be found. If it is the case, let's say if the US ultimately at a national level, through a free trade agreement with the EU, were to agree to the GDPR or something equivalent, right? We were talking about interoperability, so kind of mutual recognition of something similar, and the EU was satisfied that the EU's that the US national, that it had a national law in place and regulatory framework, which it doesn't. Then I'm not sure it would be a question about balkanizing. It would be really kind of forcing other countries to adopt similar standards, right? It's a similar approach. If you have the two largest economies in the world doing that. Now, whether China would join, that's, you know, probably unlikely. Would it balkanize in the world economy between a sort of a China realm and an Atlantic, transatlantic, and then add the Japan and a few other Asia Pacific countries? You know, that would be likely. So it would be balkanized in that sense, but in a way, in a two world or two realms regime.
Thank you. Here's one for you, Josh. It's the author of The Digital Silk Road, Anupam Chandra. And he asks, where are you seeing, well, I should probably keep these questions anonymous, but we're really happy to have him here. So where are you seeing innovations that go beyond the USMCA on issues of digital trade? And do you think that has influenced other countries?
Yeah, thanks, Anupam. Always trust Anupam asks the difficult questions. So, like, I think USMCA is cutting edge. I don't see anything else out there that is really innovative beyond that. I mean, I think Deep has done some good groundwork, but you know, I think in terms of actually, you know, commitments that bite, then I think USMCA is really where it's at. But I think clearly USMCA is lacking in a whole bunch of areas. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Cybersecurity. I mean, that's clearly a huge trade issue, which gets a mention and encourages cooperation and so forth, but clearly needs to be, I think, built on. So I would anticipate in further iterations that we will see more of that. But I don't see anything out there beyond USMCA that I think takes the ball further in a meaningful way.
Well, could you just talk a little bit about Australia's approach with those MOUs on, for example, AI and in their digital economy agreements?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of the MOUs. I mean, whether I don't know if whether they're called digital economy agreements or free trade agreements. I don't know if that's actually a meaningful distinction. Maybe Stephanie, you've got more insight on that.
I'm happy to have a go at that one, because I was actually going to mention in the deeper context, I agree with you, Josh, there's a lot there that needs to be fleshed out, although I actually think that's quite a useful model given how rapidly the technology itself is evolving. A trade agreement by its nature is necessarily a snapshot in time, and I think that there's a lot about the digital economy that is moving more quickly than a snapshot. But I do think that one of the areas where Australia and Singapore have this MOU that DEPA is looking at, and that's not really well articulated in USMCA, is around artificial intelligence. And I mean, I think we are, on the cusp of quite a further transformation in the digital economy thanks to artificial intelligence. But there's a lot about that that's not, the implications are not well understood, the regulatory settings are not well articulated. And that is something that we're going to need to look at, because there are some pretty major questions around the ethics, the governance, the interoperability, the trading of artificial intelligence algorithms and models that really needs to be looked at very carefully. So I know that there's been a lot of work that's been done in the OECD, for example, on principles for AI, but that is an area where there has not yet been, to go back to the question, a lot of innovation and governance, but there needs to be. I think that that's really the next big area that regulators and trade negotiators are going to want to look at.
Well, just as a little aside, we've been doing the word analysis, Thomas and I, of the words, at least in the non-papers at the WTO, and AI barely comes up, but 3D printing does. Okay, so this is probably for you, Stephanie. As for data localization, can it be said that DEPA provides more policy space for countries by recognizing a state's own regulatory requirements as compared to USMCA?
Yes. I don't know if Josh and Patrick are both smiling. Maybe that means I'm right. I mean, yes, it does. USMCA is a very blunt instrument, I guess. It just says, you're not allowed to essentially have forced data localization. Whereas I think DEPA very clearly recognises the right of the state to regulate, the need for policy space. And I think that is, notwithstanding all the very valid concerns that Patrick raised earlier around the potential for a kind of protectionistic abuse of that concept, I think that there is many countries would feel that they need to retain some degree of policy space around sort of important public policy interests. I think certainly including all of the deeper countries. But I don't know if Patrick or Josh have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, these cross agreement comparisons are hard. USMCA, certainly includes exceptions, provisions to all the data flow commitments in the digital trade chapter is in different ways subject to exceptions commitments. So, broadly speaking, you see the same trade-off and flexibility that you get in the rest of the agreement. So I'm not sure how that maps onto a DEPA. I mean, as I said, I think DEPA's picked up on essentially what was in CPTPP, and then it puts a whole bunch of sort of markers down for future cooperation, more or less. But in those areas where there are actually sort of binding commitments, I think it's a similar structure with a similar level of exception.
Patrick?
Yeah, well, it comes back. I think it's similar, right? In a way, both. DEPA, the USMCA, which builds very much on language in the CPTPP, recognize, again, start from the premise that, yes, we want cross-border flows. All the members, the signing members agree not to do data localization unless obviously they feel they have to. And then we're back to this, legitimate public policy objective, which remains undefined. So yes, everyone recognizes the need for kind of a regulatory space at the domestic level, but we don't know how broad it is in scope and how much it can diverge from other countries, right? So, earlier Joshua mentioned in the USMCA, the exception for financial services, for data and financial services, which can be localized domestically because governments, the regulators might need to have quick access to it in the context of a financial crisis or something. But what about health, right? Is that something that requires or that is a legitimate public policy objective where no, health data cannot be exported beyond its borders? And Australia is one of the countries that has language regulations that prevents that. In Canada, we have provinces that localize data. I mean, so far, no one has challenged this. Well, we'll see with the USMCA. No one has done it under CPTPP. Is it one of those things where no one will dare challenge it so that they don't get challenged themselves? And there's going to be trying to, not rock the boat in that sense. And as long as it's not too egregious, there will be this sort of implicit agreement, which is fine. But then it also raises, to me, again, it goes back to this issue of uncertainty for business, right? How much could the rules change very quickly? So, if there is a free trade agreement, business goes in, they think they're going to have access, and then all of a sudden they don't have access. And then what, right? What happens if you're Microsoft or Google trying to offer cloud services, or Amazon? And then all of a sudden, no, you can't do that for this type of data or that type of data. Are they going to complain to their governments? Will the governments push forward their complaints in a dispute settlement mechanism? These are all, to me, uncertainties which I'm not sure are to the benefit of what the trade agreements are actually trying to do, which is why then it goes back to maybe we need to work more together at the international level to really come up with more precise language as to where do we want data to flow freely, and where are we okay with that data not to flow? Is it on a sectoral basis? Is it on different types of data? And these kinds of things. We haven't even talked about data ownership in terms of what happens if a country decides that no, individuals will own their data. Well, then how do you actually, does that prevent all of a sudden data from flowing abroad if there is no recognition of data ownership in other countries? Just to mention that.
I think it's starting to happen, although you don't see it at the WTO. I think an example of it would be the banning of the 59 apps by India. The United States has banned use by government officials of TikTok, Face Act, but it hasn't banned the app, and India did. You can imagine what that means to Chinese businesses, It's next. So I think your point is well taken. Got an interesting question here. Why shouldn't developing countries try to protect or develop their domestic digital economies by leveraging data flow restrictions? They market access to technology multinationals and get little in return. No taxes, no jobs, no tech transfer. You want to take that?
Sorry, Susan, you dropped out a little bit. I'm going to...
Read it yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. It's the question, why shouldn't developing countries try to protect or develop their... Does everyone see it? Does anyone want to take that?
Look, I'll just. I think there's a lot there, and the only point I probably make a couple of brief points. I think it's a complicated agenda. The tax bit, I think, is worth carving out and thinking about separately, because if there's a broader issue around base erosion, profit shifting, and essentially how multinationals are taxed and where they're taxed, and so. I think that's a bigger issue than just in the digital space. So the digital space, I think, brings it home in a very specific way. It also, I think, depends on how one thinks of what benefits you get from access to data and digital technologies. And this is not radically different from how one thinks of essentially imports, in that if you take cloud computing or you take AI as an example, increasingly these will be technologies that will suffuse an economy and should improve productivity and business performance. If you want to tax them or restrict access to them, there's a potential tax and harm on the broader economy. You may want to develop that domestic industry yourself, but there are going to be trade-offs involved. I think it's worthwhile to be clear about what those trade-offs in fact are.
Anyone else want to comment?
Well, just to add, I mean, I completely agree with what Josh has said, but also, if you look at some of the analytical work that's been done on the impact of forced data localization or cross-border data flow restrictions of other kinds, there's a pretty clear impact on reducing GDP for all those reasons that Josh has talked about. It's not just one-way traffic. There are a lot of benefits that economies get from the cross-fertilization of ideas, of technology, of for small businesses and those developing economies, having access to sort of cloud-based back office services and so on. That those all add value to an economy. And if you cut that off, driven by some sort of economic data nationalism, then you're actually reducing your economic welfare overall rather than enhancing it. So I think there's a tendency to think, well, if to India, I know has very explicitly talked about, well, with data goes jobs, so we're going to stop the data at the border. But I think that's really the wrong way of looking at how the value is generated.
Should there be some sort of capacity building inherent in all of these trade agreements?
Well, for digital specifically?
For digital, yeah.
Well, maybe it would be a recognition in a way, as Joshua mentioned with CPTPP for countries like Vietnam, for instance, where there is a transition period where they are allowed to do more data localization, and maybe in a way even in terms of services, right? Preventing, not just focusing on limiting data flow, cross-border data flows, but maybe even if you're trying to develop in a way your domestic industry in terms of developing applications, AI and things like that, well, then it has to go beyond data. It also has to involve the actual services. So if you want, develop a competitor to Netflix, well, then you have to prevent Netflix from, delivering its services into your country. Or if it's, cloud services where you want to develop your own, cloud service in your own country. So, and these are the kind of traditional trade protectionist measures that have been used, where sometimes it's about goods, but in these cases would be about digital services. But obviously, as both Joshua and Stephanie mentioned, it comes at a cost, and countries will have ultimately would have to balance that cost. It also means that because of reciprocity, they may not have access to the other markets. So again, is it kind of an infant industry protection until you can compete? But then really, will a domestic business be able to compete against these behemoths like Amazon or Facebook or Google, even if they've developed to a certain scale within their country or within a small region? That is a big if. Is it better to focus on areas where there might not be, in a way where the kind of more value-added specific services or applications, and then the big question is about, which is a discussion we're having here in Canada, is about protecting the intellectual property, protecting the investments, and this goes back to competition policy, which is about then startups develop, right? And then all of a sudden, once they reach just a certain scale and potentially become interesting, then the big players come in and buy them out, and they put a fair amount of money on the table, obviously way below what this new technology could do once integrated into a big Google, but enough for the investors to say, oh wow, we're getting 100 million for this, and then of course Google says, oh well, now it's worth actually $1 billion to us in terms of revenues. So this is more about competition policy, protecting potentially IP, investments that are made, and this is certainly a debate that is going on here in Canada because we're facing that.
Thank you. I think if it's okay with you, we have time for one more question. And it's not a trade question. X asks, might the panelists comment on the role of other forums in rulemaking to foster harmonized standards and interoperability, such as the ITU, OECD, G7, G20 AI principles? Is anyone going to start?
Was that commenting on those principles to inform digital rulemaking?
I think they're asking why not do it outside of trade agreements. You know, could you do a better job at the OECD or ITU or, as Patrick mentioned, Digital Standards Board?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, you know, partly the point Patrick was making earlier, which is that you don't do all of that in trade agreements. AI ethics and AI principles, you know, being looked at elsewhere. There's going to be a very significant role for AI standards, which are being looked at in the IEEE or the IEC or the ISO. You know, cybersecurity standards are probably going to come national up and be plurilateralized, and then trade agreements can, you know, refer back to and pull in those substantive sort of governance regimes into a trade agreement where necessary. But I don't think anyone thinks that, you know, these standards should themselves be negotiated in the context of a trade agreement. But there are clearly trade elements to this digital space, the data flow bit, the balancing the space of regulatory economy, pushing back on some of the more harmful and less cost-effective regulation, which is clearly central to what trade agreements should be focusing on.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Well, I just put in a small advertisement for APEC, which does, you know, in the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or as, you know, it's sometimes described, a perfect excuse for a conversation. And I think in this area, you know, having the chance to talk these things through without the kind of sort of Damocles hanging over your head of being in a negotiation, but actually being able to understand and explore some of the ways that these areas might be regulated or you know, policies might be developed is very important. And of course, APEC does bring in a lot of the, you know, very significant digital economies, norm makers, countries with big digital corporates and so on. So I think it's, you know, a really promising area where, you know, a lot of these issues can be traversed, and there is a lot of work going on in that context on developing that up.
Patrick?
Well, I mean, and there's always the danger, obviously, of forum shopping, and ultimately nothing happens because, you know, every forum has its own rules, and countries are, okay, we're going to try to influence here, and that's where we participate, you know, in APEC and the ITU, but not in OECD. So, you know, China being an example. Also, one of the issues is also the fact that data, the digital world, as Stephanie mentioned, is evolving very rapidly. So it begs the question of these organizations, do they have the ability to keep up in a way? Do they have enough? Are they deep enough in terms of knowledge, you know, technical knowledge to, you know, if we're going to develop standards to allow, in a way, for countries that share the same standards and therefore build a kind of trust environment to trade, to flow data across borders and do digital trade, you know, make sure that the rules keep up in a way. And I think that, to me, that's why I come back to the financial services industry or financial regulation, where, you know, you have the banks, the financial regulators working together at the international level to try to adapt their standards. It's not perfect, and we know that, but it seems to work better, I would think, than maybe focusing on the OECD or focusing on APEC, which tend to be probably much more at the principles level than specific standards that would allow, in a way, the kind of mutual recognition or interoperability that we were talking about. So maybe, you know, we need to set up a new body to do that with actual the good enough resources, and also monitoring and potentially even enforcement capacity in terms of saying, oh, sorry, you know, if you're not keeping up, you're not implementing these best standards, then, you know, you can't flow this data. There will be limits on doing that. And maybe that's what we need to do.
Wow. Well, here's what I've learned. Technology is moving too fast for us to regulate or govern. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you to our audience. We really appreciate your questions, and we really appreciate your participation. I hope everybody has a great day. Happy Canada Day.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for inviting me. And this was a great conversation. And Stephanie, Joshua, I look forward to the next time we can exchange ideas.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, everyone. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks all the audience.